It is 7:30 p.m. Wednesday, the 11th of March in Vanuatu, and there are significant updates to cover regarding the forecast of severe tropical cyclone Pam. Beginning with the official forecast from the Fiji Meteorological Services, you can see that they are forecasting almost a due southerly track over the next 24 to 48 hours, and in the process they are forecasting the storm to reach Category 4 intensity based on their scale. According to the South Pacific Tropical Cyclone Scale, a Category 4 designation would signify maximum 10-minute sustained winds between 86 knots and 107 knots. Now, although that would be a severe tropical cyclone in its own right, it looks as though based on the most recent model data that even this forecast is way too conservative. In fact, if you convert the JTWC forecast to 10-minute sustained winds, they're calling for a maximum intensity of 128 knots just as the center of circulation is passing either over or just to the east of southern Vanuatu. So needless to say, there is a very high likelihood that Tropical Cyclone Pam will easily attain Category 5 intensity as the storm potentially moves directly over central or southern Vanuatu. As I mentioned a moment ago, the United States Joint Typhoon Warning Center is much more aggressive with their intensity forecast. You can see here that they are forecasting maximum 1-minute sustained winds in excess of 145 knots. When you perform the conversion to 10-minute sustained winds, you're looking at 10-minute sustained winds within the range of 125 to 130 knots, just as the eye is beginning to make its closest approach to the central and southern portions of the Vanuatu island chain. Something else that obviously needs to be pointed out, and this is something that I failed to mention using the prior image as well, is that both the Fiji and JTWC forecast tracks have shifted westward within the last 6 to 12 hours. This is based on a continuing westward trend in the model guidance that is taking the storm closer and closer towards Vanuatu, and we're going to closely look at this guidance in just a moment. First, however, this is a look at the tropical cyclone over the last 6 to 12 hours. You can see earlier today, before we lost the daytime visible satellite imagery, that an eye was starting to become more apparent. We don't see it quite as much now that we're losing the visible satellite, and it's also being covered by some of the upper level cirrus cloud cover that is being emanated from the eye wall. Nonetheless, it is still more than apparent that the center of circulation is well embedded within this central dense overcast. This is the area of strongest convection and thunderstorm activity, and in terms of the outflow, it has nearly perfect radial symmetric outflow both in the equatorward and poleward outflow channels, so this is a signature that the mid to upper level atmospheric environment is primed for rapid intensification. Now, the US JTWC is already initializing this storm with maximum 1-minute sustained winds of 100 knots, which is already the equivalent of a Category 3 major hurricane in the Atlantic, and the only reason why Pam is not a Category 4 or Category 5 already is because this is such a large storm, and sometimes these storms need to consolidate or contract so that they can take better advantage of the ideal conditions that they are being presented with, and that is something that we are expecting over the next day or so. Once the eye becomes fully apparent on satellite, it may begin as a rather large eye, but once the eye begins to consolidate or contract, that'll be the most likely time when the storm reaches its peak intensity of about 145 to 150 knots based on a 1-minute sustained wind, and closer to about 130 knots if you take the 10-minute average. This is an enhanced infrared satellite view of the storm, and all this really shows is how cold the cloud tops are getting. The darker the red or the white and dark gray or black colors represent extremely cold cloud tops. This is where the thunderstorm updrafts are rising the highest in the atmosphere, which is an indication of where the strongest storms are located, of course near the eye wall. And here is an even more stunning enhanced infrared satellite image coming from the University of Wisconsin. This is a better color scale, and it's showing cloud tops as cold as negative 101 degrees Celsius. Looking ahead, beginning with the latest 0Z run of the American GFS model, this is the surface winds representation valid for 12 o'clock noon local time on Friday, and unfortunately the GFS is holding steady with its idea that this monster Category 5 cyclone is going to plow directly through Vanuatu. You can see that the center is passing just to the south of the island of Pentecost, and it's expected to pass directly across all of the remaining southern islands, including Port Vila here, as it passes directly over them. This would be a completely catastrophic track If the storm were to verify on this path as a Category 5, this would be about as severe of a tropical cyclone impact as you could ever experience. But what is even more concerning this evening is that the European ECMWF appears to be coming into better agreement with this GFS solution. If you've been following our updates over the last few days, you may recall that the European has been more easterly with its track, taking the inner core, or the most destructive part of Pam, just to the east of these islands. But over the last 3 to 4 model cycles, we've seen very subtle shifts closer toward the GFS, more toward the west, and perhaps the most substantial shift has just occurred with the most recent update that has become available within the last few hours. You can see initially we're looking at 12 o'clock noon on Friday. The storm is still a bit to the east of the GFS track, but it becomes certainly more ominous as we go into Friday afternoon and evening. The western eye wall, despite the eye being too far to the east compared to the GFS, is still potentially impacting Port Vila. So either way, both model solutions are not good for these areas, and it only gets worse for Aramongo and Tana as we go into late Friday night and the early morning hours on Saturday, as the eye is forecast to move directly overhead. To gain a better understanding of the forecast track philosophy, I also wanted to point out some of the mid-level steering across the region. We're looking at the mid-level steering flow, and just to gain your bearings, this is New Caledonia, Vanuatu, and severe tropical cyclone Pam. Over the Coral Sea, we see that there is the presence of a weak mid-level steering ridge, but this steering ridge is not strong enough to pull the tropical cyclone toward the west into the northern Coral Sea. Also, we have a secondary mid-level ridge located farther into the South Pacific near American Samoa, and directly between these two ridges is a fairly weak trough or weakness between the two ridges, and it's situated between New Zealand and Vanuatu. The problem for Vanuatu is that the models are showing over the next 30 hours that the main base or trough axis is going to set up shop at a slightly more western longitude. So the storm is going to want to have a tendency to move into that weakness between the two ridges, which very well could set up from southwest to northeast, at least temporarily, between New Caledonia and the central and southern islands. So this is why the storm is going to take the path of least resistance, and that's why we could see a south-southwest motion, which would place these islands in grave danger. As we move into the 48-hour time frame, once again, you're looking at noon local time on Friday. We see the end result of this pattern taking shape. The storm moves directly over some of the islands that we've seen at a higher resolution image, and this type of forecast pattern is also the reason why interests in New Caledonia cannot completely let their guard down just yet. Although no model guidance is showing the storm tracking directly over New Caledonia, such a pattern would suggest that we could still see a couple more shifts toward the west. I wouldn't go as far as to say that the track is going to eventually end up over New Caledonia, but it's still something certainly to watch, as the storm is still about 48 to 72 hours away from its closest point of approach. Now, beyond 48 to 72 hours, we see much stronger mid-level energy and vorticity coming in from Tasmania and New South Wales. This is associated with a much stronger shortwave trough, and this will be the final kicker that starts to push Pam more toward the east, and that is why we think that this will be a saving grace for New Zealand. As the storm becomes extra tropical, it will more than likely pass to the east, so all significant impacts should remain to the north and east of New Zealand. But of course, you're starting to get into the medium range, so once again, as we told interest in New Caledonia, you may also just want to keep an eye on this storm for potential down the road impacts. And just as I was about to close out the video, we did receive another forecast track update from the U.S. Joint Typhoon Warning Center. The track has not been adjusted all that significantly, but if anything, it is once again slightly closer towards southern Vanuatu, with the potential for the western eye wall, even if this track were to verify, to pass over these islands, so they would still more than likely receive severe cyclone force winds. Now is the time to make these preparations. You want to brace yourself for the potential of a Category 5 direct hit, the worst of all tropical cyclone landfalls. And currently the JTWC has increased their initial intensity to 105 knots, and they are still forecasting the storm to pass through this area at a maximum 1 minute sustained wind of about 145 knots, which would make Pam a Category 5 on every single tropical cyclone scale. So take the action now before conditions become worse. That sums up your 28storms.com Cyclone Pam video update for this Wednesday evening. Keep it tuned to 28storms.com/cyclone and our social media accounts for more updates on this storm and other systems across the South Pacific.